Okay, well, my name's Frank Tester. I teach in the School of Social Work at the University of British Columbia, and my work actually is with extractive industries in the Eastern Arctic. I work in Nunavut territory, which is currently overrun by multinational corporations from all over the world. I think that's something that it probably has in common with Kenya and many other countries in Africa. And having worked in East Africa, I recognize that there are a lot of similarities between two environments and climates, which at first glance are very different. But in actual fact, the dynamics are very similar. So I want to introduce Patrick Ochieng, who started the Ujamaa Institute in Kenya, which is focused on fostering the development of social movements and organizations that take social justice seriously and environmental issues. And of course, Kenya, as I just said, has been swamped by Chinese investors and corporations interested in its mineral wealth. And of course, that's, as Patrick explained to me, has resurrected all of the old players as well from Europe and Japan and other parts of the world. So without any further ado, over to you. Welcome.
Thank you. I want kind of to talk about extractives in Africa very generally, I mean, without being very specific to Kenya, because if we narrow this to Kenya, sometimes it becomes too detailed for an audience like the one we have in the room today. And the slides are just there to help me kind of think logically. I mean, if you're an activist, sometimes thinking logically becomes very problematic because you sort of just deal with very organic things and you respond to them as they flow. So don't take this to be a barrier between our communications, and we all can interact with this. So I wanted to, I'll have to be doing this because the cable is short, but I think it's important for us to, I mean, everybody knows this, but sometimes it's nice to just understand where all this is coming from. And I think more than half the countries in Africa, I mean, see minerals as important, and they play a part in it at the international level, and they think it's a very critical part of their economy. And in terms of production world over, Africa is huge. I mean, it's not small. But the important thing is that all of this is done for the international market. I mean, I don't think the evolution of mining was for Africa's, interests. It was being done for the external market, and that background is very important. And the other feature that you will find in African extraction is that there's a paradox. You have all this natural resource wealth, but also you have grinding poverty, existing side by side. And this poverty seems to be worsening, as years go by. And there are new discoveries, new in quote. And so it's very difficult to understand that paradox, but I think I'm going to try and explain what I think informs that paradox. And then this export mining was not a creation of African states. Export mining was a creation of the colonial state, and the colonial state is very concerned about the political and legal security of that mining. So they did a lot of other institutional and legal arrangements, that support that export mining, and that makes sure African labor is available, it can be found, it can be accessed, it can be underpaid, and that mining can happen. So I think this evolution is important in understanding what's happening now. So I thought it would be a good place to start from. But then if you look at the post-colonial Africa, the Africa that was getting independent in the 60s and the 70s, each country started some industrialization project of some kind. I mean, everybody kind of started designing a path, that they thought was unique to them. And industrialization was a priority for virtually, all of them. those that emerged from that struggle. But then there were different possibilities. Import substitution was a big thing, those days. We're saying we need to really have our own homegrown industry, do our own things, Nyerere in Tanzania tried, what's called Ujamaa, which means a self-reliance, small village economies, that depend on each other. Some countries tried socialist, communist, the things we were struggling with in the last workshop. But then the capitalist model seemed to have overtaken everybody else. For those who know, there was also the non-aligned movement, people who decided we're going to do this without necessarily trying what other people have forced us to try. But then all these things didn't quite, fix the industrialization, dilemma that these countries had. And so in the early 80s, African governments met in Lagos and, came up with the Lagos Plan of Action, where they were talking of decreasing their reliance on raw materials, extraction, and dealing with the global imbalance in trade. And I think there was a lot of optimism then when this Lagos Plan of Action was developed. And a lot of African scholars were saying maybe we've started to fix what, looks like our African paradox and problems. But then after World War II, the colonial state was also very creative. They started establishing vehicles, mineral development vehicles, state, enterprises that would drive, the colonial state was also withdrawing and kind of coming up with a strategy where you would then have these entities, that look democratic, that look different, that then would make mining, friendlier and so on. And so they also realized that mining was detached, from the rest of the economy, and so they needed to deal with that, and so on and so forth. And in the early 80s and 90s, that also didn't help. Yesterday in the main opening, we were talking about the lie between what extractives does and what it really is. They say it creates jobs, but when you analyze critically, there are no jobs that get created. They say it benefits local economies, but when you study the local situations, you don't find any of those benefits. So that false picture is what led to all these attempts at doing different things in different times. But then in the early 80s and 90s, the World Bank policies of liberalization, I think World Bank did a study, and in this study, World Bank was saying Africa's mining is not performing, and African mining is performing poorly, and we need to change it and improve it so that it performs and deals with recovery of African economies, because African economies then were extremely indebted. And I think the World Bank, although they don't say it, are always interested in collecting their debts. And many times they propose solutions and come up with nice papers. But if you read the papers keenly, you'll find that it's intended to help them continue, collecting, their debt collection strategies. I don't know if African governments know this, but sometimes they behave as if they don't know. This is one of the conclusions, that study made, and it's very interesting. I mean, they were saying the future development of the mining industry would largely depend on attracting new high-risk capital from foreign companies, because historically it was international mining companies which provided the management and technical capabilities and mobilized the necessary financing for mining. I mean, this they unashamedly, wrote in a public document. I mean, which is to say, Africans have no capacity for, engaging with this important sector, and at all times you need international capital that can absorb risk, that we can't absorb risk, and essentially that we can't solve our internal problems. And so that report prescribed that Africans the states need to get out of mining, and they need to, in its place, substitute the state with private investment. And if you add this to the fact that Africa has always been a target, for global economic powers, all those guys, as a supplier of strategic raw materials, then you begin to see the picture of the extractive sector that we do talk about. I mean, I'm sure this is a picture that you're familiar with, that yes, there was a place and people needed to, in the global economic system, Africa has always been a place of interest for several other people. Sometimes they scramble for it, sometimes they're able to tear it into pieces, enjoy it for a moment, and if it's too bad, they return it. Sometimes it gets a little bit bitter, and they return the piece to wherever they remove the puzzle. So what we then saw was...
Can you say what year this kind of thing is happening? What year, at what point?
At what point?
Yeah, this is like 2000, 2005.
This is historical.
No, this is historical.
No,
This,
not this. The thing
yeah, the World Bank, when the World Bank did a report here. Yeah, this report was, I think, in the year 2007, 8 there. I mean, it's not a very old phenomena. And now my machine is saying what? Yeah. Yeah, so then what then happened is we saw a reduction in state participation in mining enterprises across Africa. We then saw a wide range of incentives, for foreign direct investment, tax holidays, 10 years, if you wanted to invest in Africa. And each African country was trying to come up with favorable regimes, for FDI, what we sometimes call the race to the bottom. The cheaper you are, the more attractive. And each country was in this craze to become attractive for investment. And we liberalized exchange rates, to make it easy for these companies to do business. We gave companies what's called investment protection assurances. In the mineral development agreements, you'd have what are called stabilization clauses. A clause that guarantees, the investment, that they are able to take their dividend, to their home countries, that you as a state will not expropriate, you can't push them, you'll allow them to do business. And so the product was then what we are calling a winner's curse. You kind of a winner, but you're a cursed winner. And you are almost at this bottom that you don't, get any benefits from extraction. And it then generated consequences. I mean, you had a situation where from the 60s, Africa had GDPs that were falling. Because you have this situation of you have resources, but you don't really get anything from those resources. So this is then the trend. And these are indicators from the World Bank. So if they're from the World Bank, I suspect you should look at them with suspicion. And maybe maybe they were very conservative. I mean, so you can conjure up what might be the true situation. Now, what this did by 2007, and that's the date thing, was that African governments began to worry about, this trend. And the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa organized a meeting in 2007, called the Policy Big Table, to discuss this extractive crisis with ADB and the African Union. And so that led to a document in February of 2009, where heads of states and government adopted a vision, what's called the African Mining Vision. There are copies of this, but it's also available online from the UNECA website. I think I have a copy I can give to Samir so that they can share. But then this AMV was actually the first aspiration, where the political leadership was saying we would like to change the orientation of extraction in Africa. And a lot of them were interested in changing the mining policies and the institutional culture, that drives mining. It has very, very interesting provisions. It's a very useful document. It's one that, if they implemented, would really change the circumstance of extraction in Africa. But then it's important for us to just reflect a little bit on the results of what the World Bank was calling reforms, because the World Bank discourse was coached as reforms. And so nowadays when I hear the word reforms, I somewhat don't get what it's supposed to achieve, but they were saying they were reforming, the extractive sector. The African mining vision would be, in Africa, the loudest, and most unified political statement that you can find about extraction. But then the road to that African mining vision, even though African governments were sitting, they were not quite together. I mean, because after the African mining vision consensus, all of them then do their own things. Yeah, they discuss with China, somebody discusses with the US, another one discusses with, Canada. And they have all these bilateral arrangements, that do not, go back to the collective document that they have come up with. So it's like parallel lines, running. So you talk about it, you agree, and you are all deja vu about it, but then you go back and do your very own things, because of different promises. And that is sort of a dilemma that is still with us. But that re-examination was also provoked by the 2008 crisis. I mean, what we were calling economic crisis. I mean, I've never believed that there was an economic crisis in the US, but if a bank decides to sell, loans several times over to another bank, and they're all clever people, that's not a crisis in my view. But
Sorry, when the common man and the government.
yeah, but it's also useful then to look at who the players are in Africa today. This is 2013, and this is a study that was done right here in Vancouver by Travis, and it sort of presents what Canadian interests in Africa, look like in the extractive sector, and he did a splendid job to just place it there in billions. What kind of investments does Canada, have on the continent? And one begins to wonder, when did Canada come in, and where are the others? So then you begin to situate what I was talking about with the true picture on the ground. If you ask the question, what about the others? But about Canada, for example, Toronto, we all know, established itself as a major fundraising destination for African mining exploration. I mean, any exploration company that was serious about Africa, came and registered in Toronto because there are enough incentives and, subsidies to support them to do that work in Africa. And according to Natural Resources Canada, federal ministry, there were 155 Canadian companies with a massive asset of about 31.6 billion Canadian dollars, operating in 39 countries in 2011. I mean, that was figures I could find then. I'm sure the situation has changed. And that was up from 26.9 in 2010. So between 2010 and 2011, you can see the phenomenal increase. And so we've been saying Canada was marching to Africa. Well, we still need to find reasons why, but the Prime Minister negotiated, what we're calling investment promotion and protection agreement with a number of countries in Africa. I don't know whether that is supposed to be a good thing, or something to worry about. So one of the chief executives of the Canadian oil and gas exploration case reported that Africa Oil was offered US dollars 930 million by investors when seeking funding, while it only wanted to raise 450. So there was too much money, and so the money needed to follow the resources, because they only asked for 450, somebody offered 930. So these are some of the interesting images, mental images of what extraction can be. But there are other players in this context. Since the late 2000s, there have been new phases of expanded terrain in investment in mining, in oil, in gas. And that is a trend, that in 2006 there were about 4,000 junior companies. These are companies that are doing exploration basically. And when they get a discovery, they sell it to the bigger, more established companies. One such company is called the Africa Oil, which is registered here. When they got oil in Kenya, they sold that discovery to Tullow, which is an Irish company. So they still are jointly working together. Now, China, on its part, pledged $3 billion to Africa in what was the Africa-China Development Fund, and they established an African Commodities Trade Center in China. So there have been every 3 years summits between Africans' heads of state and the Chinese government to discuss these things. And it started from $1 billion, and in the third year it had hit $3 billion in terms of supporting Africa. Supporting Africa, let's put it that way. Now, because of those trends, China and Canada, there are old hands that have been in Africa. I mean, the EU has been in Africa for God knows how long. Japan, the US, and in the midst of these trends, you probably begin to think that these were the people who discovered the minerals, and now there are other new players, who are coming in. They were not going to watch it happen, without a response. And so they also then had to rush. And so there's almost like a new rush. And so you have British Gas, Total, and so on, BG. All of these guys are exploring in one place or the other. And so, again, we can say Africa is another big issue, as a result of this. What then I did was to try and examine what might be the drivers of this new extraction, apart from that evolution that I've talked about. Now, if you look at the discourses in the world, the demand for minerals, oil and natural gas from China, India, and Brazil, these three huge entities, has been increasing. And so there's a glut, so someone has to supply to fulfill that glut. And in a sense, that's why a lot of these nations are moving into Africa to then respond to that. But beyond that, there have been a lot of price increases, in terms of price volatility, that even low-grade and complicated ores have become financially attractive. Things that didn't matter are suddenly very useful because, everybody's buying something. So even the things that we traditionally thought maybe this we can leave, I think it became attractive business-wise to go for those. And then we have this idea of technological changes that allow extraction of such dispersed ores as well as hard to access hydrocarbons. I mean, technology has enabled them to also reach out to things that ordinarily were difficult to think about. And now offshore mining is big, because technology, allows that to happen. And those who are doing offshore mining in Tanzania can trace the blocks sometimes to other countries. In Tanzania, there's oil and gas in Mtwara, and that block of oil and gas in Mtwara is traced up to the Kenyan coast. And so very quickly, someone has to run into Kenya and get exploration licenses and rights, and so that they continue to do what they're already doing on the other side of the border. Then there were also issues of policy and institutional changes, that have made tax regimes favorable, royalty, and the environment for investors has been made really not attractive, cheap. You can walk in, I think you don't need a visa, all this. And if you say you're an investor, you are given VIP treatment and so on. The other things that are unrelated to, what's happening outside Africa are things that are happening inside Africa. If you look at our national economic development models, the Vision 2030s and 2020s, there's a template. I don't know where that template came from, but it seems to be a template across Africa that is kind of articulating where Africa wants to be at some point in the future. And each country has some vision of development. As an African, I haven't participated in a process, that sought my views to build, a collective vision of, where we want to go as a country. But I know we have a vision. and so this model, if you study those models, many of them are saying natural extraction is an important pillar of achieving, those visions. And so each country is trying to kind of find out how it can do that it wants to grow, that if it wants to grow, then it needs to invest in its natural capital. And when many African states survey their macroeconomic prospects, their conclusion seems to be that the best option for them to grow quickly resides in extraction of the subsoil resources. And I don't think you can convince an African president to delay extraction. In fact, if any discovery was made, they would want it to move to exploitation within weeks, because they think that's the place where they can, the game changer, can happen. And so they don't encourage a lot of debate and consensus building, on whether they should mine or not. In fact, the people who live on areas that have minerals look to them as, an impediment, as a barrier. And they bulldoze them out if they send, tractors to get them out of those places. And those are stories that dot the continent. Now, the other thing that though not spoken about, that might be driving this from the African context is the fact that mineral revenues are centralized. They're easy to appropriate, and Africans, heads of state, need money that they can touch quickly. Yeah, and so this is a very attractive form, because when you're doing extractive resources, you don't have to worry too much about accountability. Citizens have a lot of voice when they produce taxes, when they pay taxes, because they also feel, with taxation, then there is an obligation on the part of the state to, account. And so sometimes we demonstrate to say, no taxation without, without services. And if it's mineral resources, then the governments don't have to account to you. I mean, you don't know where the money came from. I mean, what are you talking about? So there's this. So if they can find an option to the dispersed, difficult tax revenues, they very easily go for it. And this also drives despotism, because the moment they have this money that is so easy to access and quick and is centralized, the next thing they want to invest in is militaries and, police and tear gas, so just make it difficult for, people to raise issues. And if you look at, there's a correlation between undemocratic states and, and extraction. Yeah, pretty much like the debate we were having about sex and, in the opening. A very interesting analogy. Now, so one of the key concerns for African governments is this fiscal concerns, that you can improve your fiscus. What activists like me also think is happening is that it's not just the fiscus, it's not just the desire by African governments to have centralized resources. There are also other interests that are pushing the extractive frontiers. And we think there are interest group and coalition politics, that some of which is happening in capitals like here, to really make sure that this frontier is expanded. And there are lobbies, both domestic and international, that are pushing this agenda. hydrocarbon companies, consultancies. If you're a consultant in oil and gas, I mean, it is in your best interest that new areas are opened up and so on and so forth. And some of these consultants are very high profile. They have connections with really the top African presidents, and they can influence the way, African presidents think. Those who are familiar with Tanzania, there was a consultant, I think from Norway or somebody, who influenced Tanzania to change their entire land policy, DeSoto. And the president was so bought to DeSoto's theory around, land registration, and until he gave him an office at the office of the president and funded some huge program which failed because it was going to fail anyway. And so these guys are also making sure that they convince African leaders to take on this agenda and really open up those frontiers. And though not talked about because they're supposed to be our allies, are extractive industry workers' unions, who also would like to maintain their jobs, and so on and so forth. So it is in their interest that the sector grows. But finally, the military. I mean, because extraction and the military are, really bedfellows, and they benefit from each other. So these are sort of the things that are driving the African extractive sector. It's different in each country, but this is the overall overarching situation. So just a little bit on what risks are associated with this, because there's a huge risk to all this, and it manifests in different ways. If countries adopt open cast mining, it generates a whole lot of different kinds of problems. I mean, many people are familiar with this. It transforms the landscape. If you go to Zimbabwe, hills are being flattened, for platinum and diamond mining. And you don't know what that place will look like 50 years, or 60 years today. And the discourse around post-extractivism, I think, is an important one. I mean, what will these countries look like post-extractivism? Because extraction gets finished at some point. If you look at the hydrocarbon sector, yes, they're saying new technology has reduced the scope of, landscape change. But listening to the discussions yesterday about fracking and, all the things that, we were, people shared yesterday, I mean, we pretty much are at the same point. There are issues there. So many of the concessions in Africa, you will find, are located in headwaters. It's always somewhere around, water sources. It's very close to a river or some kind of thing like that, or close to the coastlines. And, water-constrained areas, really. I mean, somehow God placed minerals where there were also other issues. Sorry. So it's very interesting that every time you concede to these things, you then compound, the water issues and other problems. And hydrocarbon extraction all over the world has a very poor history of water pollution. I mean, people know, what they have done in other places. We spoke about some of that yesterday. So with all these, I think then one wants to point this risk, to the ordinary African, to appreciate that this is it. But then there are different impacts. For example, environmental impacts, and I can't belabor this. I mean, this has been spoken about hugely, but Africa is losing a lot of forest reserves, I mean, that are just being flattened out. Land, communities are losing land. There's widespread pollution of soils, water. This whole thing about acid mine drainage, I mean, the red and yellow rivers and so on, is huge. Because our environmental, regulations are also non-existent, because we were in this rush to be attractive. And having my environmental regulations was part of the bother. So we got rid of those. So this happens without any question. If you look at social impacts, I mean, it's another huge issue. There are displacements, and many stories will exist in Africa around this. Poverty is increasing. I mean, this situation doesn't improve poverty. I don't know why. Because most of these resources go to stock exchanges. And the stock exchanges is some blind place that doesn't relate to the poor. So, yeah, I'm told markets are as blind as bats. Now then, what's terrible about this is the internal inequalities, between men and women, because extraction favors men, than it does women. Mine workers and those who are not employed, and then those who are being paid compensation and those who are not being paid. So you have all these dichotomies of, exclusion, and these things raise grievance. People then begin to have internal grievances with each other, where one group now pits itself against the other because it feels they are on the anti or the pro mining continuum. And that has upheavals that we are experiencing in different parts, of the country. Then there's also economic dependency when the extraction becomes the only thing. And so it creates an economy around it and a lot of vulnerabilities, which then follow. Apart from social impacts, there are also human rights issues, and there's militarization, of course. Every extractive industry, has almost a parallel, military that guards the interests, and they are trained and they're armed, and this is a permanent feature, across Africa. And if you think about the wars that are being fought in Congo, I mean, the mining companies are mining and they're trading, but Congo is at war. So, you want to ask, where are the contradictions here? Yeah. How is it that these companies can do uninterrupted business in a place where people have been fighting, and they've been fighting for very many years? And you can replicate that situation in several other places. Now, if you're fisher folk or hunters or farmers, there are a whole load of other problems. Yeah, because offshore extraction, affects, fisher folk. And so communities are losing, their options of livelihood. Now, if you look at the operational level, then there are abuses, at the worker level and so on, underpayment and all these things, prostitution and a number of other things that we spoke about. And there is no, yeah.
For discussion.
Yes, I think I'm done. Conflicts, I can't overemphasize this. I mean, in fact, Africa is defined by the conflicts which happen there. So anybody who thinks about Africa, the next mental image that comes is guns and who's fighting who, and sometimes those are presented as tribal wars or some tribes pitted against other tribes. I mean, I was in the US one time talking to a PhD class, and they asked me, what's this thing about Rwanda, Tutsis and Hutus, what's wrong with these tribes? I said, well, I don't know what's wrong with them, but those guys speak the same language. And this was, no, that can't be. I said, and so I said, well, between me and you, I came from Africa last week. So one of us must be more upbeat than the other. So the basic thing is sometimes the propaganda is coached in a manner that you will not understand that it's a resource struggle or it's a struggle around extraction. But that's the reality. I think then finally just a raft of challenges in terms of what the challenges look like if you look at the capture of revenue, because the African extraction, the revenue is captured. And it's difficult to tell whether those revenues can be dispersed with this kind of framework. Now, how that revenue is managed and shared, apart from Botswana that tried to come up with, a very specific fund for managing, the resources from diamond, and Ghana, which is trying to also develop mechanisms for good management, of the fiscus that they get from extractives. Other African governments will not tell you what they receive, and they will not tell you where they bank it. They kind of mix it with the other revenues, and they spend it on recurrent expenditure, and life goes on. There's an absence of specific policy frameworks to support, in particular, artisanal miners, because if we want to change the fortunes, of Africans, I think there's more hope in supporting artisanal miners, because in terms of jobs per capita, it looks more reasonable. It probably provides more opportunity, than this, big industry, fixed number of jobs and so on. So we don't have policies to support those guys. In fact, we criminalize them. We arrest them, we chase them. We don't give them spaces for doing the things that they do. We don't create a linkage between them and the larger entity. And I think it's a discussion. The vision identifies it and says very nice things about it, but the governments are not doing anything about that. And then if you're thinking exploration and mining areas, local communities can also get these things. But nobody wants to think that they can do those things, because mining is seen as something that must be done by necessarily foreigners and so on. Now then there is this debate about CSR, which sometimes is presented as, the only way we can spur sustainable development. And like I said yesterday, I think it's a lie. Then we haven't quite integrated extractives into the national and regional economies. I mean, there are countries that have national and subnational governance structures. And invariably, many extractions will be found at the subnational level. But then the national government will appropriate everything to the center without caring about, the local level. So that subsidiarity is still a difficult conversation in Africa. And the trade and investment rules, something called WTO was mooted, and Africans joined it and have signed on to a number of agreements there. And it's creating a very difficult regime for unlocking, the potential that exists in extraction, because companies can take you to court. You can be fined millions of dollars for denying them this or that, for exercising sovereignty and so on. And interestingly, we've signed on to these things. I mean, we did have a chance to ask a Kenyan trade minister why he signed the WTO agreement on trade in services. And he said, I was told in cabinet to go and sign. So, and did you read? We asked him. He said, no. My job was to sign and bring it back for reading. So he brought it back for reading. So finally, this, what we call Galamsey, the artisanal small-scale miners in Ghana. I took this picture. We went there to kind of look at what's going on there. What do we do with this sector? And this is how they do it. In fact, invariably, they're blamed for all manner of environmental issues. But because the other one has a fence and a gate, the big corporation, and some kind of a clean lawn at the entrance, one thinks that what they do is markedly different from this. But then we were saying, and the discourse should be, that what do we do with this sector? Because if we can help them get the right equipment, if we can link these guys to the market and technology and so on, maybe this would be something much more useful as an endeavor, than the obsession with the 50 or 100 years of external global mining corporations, that haven't helped Africa. So I want to stop there just so that if there are any comments or questions, but I need to add that I've been on mining activism for a long time in Africa and elsewhere. Peru, Colombia, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and so on. Just looking at what's happening there, South Africa, and taking that back to communities, because I work really at the community level. I hope I've explained something. Yes.
Is that, when you took that photograph, does that encompass the area, or is it stretch out further than that?
No, it's stretched out further. This is just one gang. You might find another gang in another place. Yeah, but now this is where all these guys are working.
And do they have a place to sell?
Do they have?
A place to sell? Can they sell?
There are people who come to buy. Some are Chinese looking. Yeah, I mean, the metal markets, of course, are in these capitals, but there are guys, bagmen and so on, who are running around with little weights, to take their stuff and so on. Yes?
Thank you very much for your extremely insightful presentation, Patrick. A couple of things. I mean, I have I suppose a comment and then a question. You talk about the propaganda that surrounds Africa, has done and continues to in the present. African regimes are seen as corrupt, and as you've already suggested, there's more than a grain of truth to this. But we also have to understand, and this has to do with its roots in colonialism, without a doubt. But we also have to understand what's happening in this country. It was announced just yesterday that the former foreign minister of the current government has just taken a senior position at Barrick Gold. Wow. So that lays bare some of the close connections between the two extractive industries and this government. So we're talking about really the interpenetration of the elite. So I think that's something that I wanted to just remind people of. I'm sure a lot of people already know about this. The other thing is, and it's closely related, and it really comes off of your last point about artisanal mining as some possibility, some possible way forward, and then obviously one would look at a certain kind of regulation of the industry and so on. One thing that this government has done is it's put virtually all of the resources of the state in the service of corporations in general, but extractives in particular. And I think that's already come out in the conference. One of the things that it's done is it's taken the CIDA, the Canadian International Development Agency, which has in the past done good work and has been quite well respected, really turned that into an arm of the state. And so what it has done essentially is it's created a new institute for the study and development of extraction mining in particular, and how it's being built is artisanal mining practices, sustainable. It's actually, I think, the key slogan is sustainable mining practices. So maybe while you're here, we can talk more about that, and you can learn more about that, and we can hear more about artisanal mining on the ground. But I think this is really key to the government strategy, is to say that, well, we're not about doing the big bad mining activities, but rather the small, supporting the small scale and artisanal.
I think also from the UN point of view, one of the reasons why they wanted to criminalize artisanal mining was because it was so vulnerable to being controlled by militias and just very violently controlled, right? And that there would be a lot of forced labor. Yeah, and I mean, in DRC and things like that, which, and all of the practices surrounding that, what happens to women and children in that situation is also terrible. So just trying to think about where there can be free collectives of mining as opposed to people who are so vulnerable, right?
I think Samir, the trade, I think, is a new instrument of colonization. I mean, if you study it carefully, and to transform CEDA's role, from one of development to trade, it really pointed to where the Canadian government was going. And I think what the Canadian government doesn't say is they're doing this to show up Canadian advantage. In fact, if you read their documentation, you will see discussion around what they mean by Canadian advantage. Now, Canadian advantage is not something that we benefit the run-of-the-mill African, who's doing small mining. So and it's very closely linked to CSR, because they've embedded CSR into that new CEDA approach. So what we need to do, I think, as activists on both sides, is to confront this, this so-called paradigm shift, and expose it for what it is, But then, if it has to support artisanal miners, then we need to define, what kind of support they give to artisanal small-scale miners. And the African Mining Vision would be a good document to start from, because it kind of identifies what can be done with that sector. And if we can help African countries develop cadasters, and so you have areas designated specifically for artisanal miners. So there is no contest, between the large entity and, the artisanal miners, that you have designated areas for them, and you have rules around how, that can be done, and the sector can be organized. I mean, there's not, the thing about militia can be managed, because there's no bigger militia than the mining companies in Africa. I mean, really.
So there's been quite a lot of organizing around this institute, a lot of opposition from students and faculty and grassroots.
Indeed, yeah. Yes.
Patrick, I wanted to ask you, you brought up yesterday some of the challenges around organizing in Kenya with lack of information. And, I'm wondering what the state of grassroots resistance is at the moment. In terms of what scale it's operating, how it's operating.
I think that's one huge area, and I think over the years Africa's social movements have lost out, and in many senses, because the sort of traditional areas where movements converged have been either killed or whittled out. You no longer have student movement. What they did is to decentralize the university. So you have all these campuses, so there's no way students, can organize and have a strong students' body. And so you in a sense, this started in Kenya with the Moi regime, where he was thinking, this is one of the areas where I'm getting opposition, so I'm gonna, dismantle this. And then you have the, intelligence in class. You have people attending classes not because they're students, but they're doing intelligence work. So it made organizing at the student level extremely impossible. And so, in a sense, we've lost the youth movement, to this, state mechanisms. Now, the workers' movement was a victim earlier, because what happened with the workers' movement is that first, the state guaranteed them their union dues through what they're calling check-off systems, statutory, deductions that are done by employers and sent to the unions. So the union leaders didn't have to perform to be paid, like in the past, where omnibus unions, you had to do something for the workers for them to give you their dues. Now, once unions were guaranteed of their income, whether they work or not, what then happened was we have union leaders who are in comfort. And because they're in comfort, they stopped to do the traditional, work of organizing. And the state pulled them very closly. And we saw the unions and the state are in bed. And the umbrella unions, if a member of a leader of an umbrella union spoke, you'd think it's the executive of Total. I mean, they actually have the same rhetoric. So then that was another site, that had issues, and this was deliberate. Now, don't talk about political parties, because political parties where now we can do the cadre work and, the boot type organizing have been appropriated by those who have capital. So it's how much money you have to own a party, and when you own that party, you decide who becomes the candidate. I mean, you don't need all this, the bother of democracy. And so you have a situation where all our sites of civic mobilization have somehow been, messed up.
That's exactly what's happening.
Yeah, and I guess it's not unique. It's not unique to Africa. Then you have an education that helps you to forget. I mean, the curriculums that we subject our kids to is one that doesn't liberate them. It doesn't help them to ask the hard questions, the why questions. In fact, if you ask a teacher, why is this demand and supply curve this way and not the other way, you'll be sent out of class. So we have intimidated inquiry, so people no longer ask, the difficult questions. People are more on, how can we do this, Yeah, what next? You know, people are rather concerned about the way forward. And in this situation, we need to be asking, what's our way out? You know, when you're in a hole, you can't go forward. You first get out, then you start looking for the way forward. So, in a sense, then the indigenization of protest, you know, where now we protest quarterly based on financial opportunities that are afforded to us, and you know, there is a per diem to sign for you know, attending one meeting or the other. I mean, there are issues there. Yes, please.
Patrick, you know, when I left Tanzania, there was this height of Mwalimu Nyerere's Ujamaa movement. You know, there was some excitement in terms of a future that was where we can have land reform and share. What happened to that vision of? And how can this vision be so thrown away in terms of allowing these companies to come and extract and exploit in this way?
Yeah, we spoke about this a little earlier. There was the age of idealism, you know, when as young people, as students, we were excited about things and we were ideal and we pushed the envelope. You know, we tried to go beyond the borders. I think that has changed. We now have a very cynical society. I mean, and that age of idealism happens when someone is young. Now, what we have done to our youth is to help them forget. You know, at least you left Tanzania when there was Ujamaa. Imagine a situation where a young person was born in 1984. He doesn't even want to hear it. I mean, what's that you're talking about? Why are you taking us back to history? So history is kind of rubbished. Lawyers run our life. I mean, everything is coached in terms of law. And so when we constitute groups, when we develop solutions, we look for lawyers. When we want to write a constitution, we look for lawyers. When we want to constitute a task force, we look for lawyers. And we think lawyers have all the answers, you know, to all the problems we have. So we are not talking to historians. We're not looking for anthropologists. We're not talking to just ordinary elders, you know, and, you know, indigenous people, because they knew they had a rhythm and they had a law that worked. And so Nyerere is now seen as a agnostic, you know, something was wrong with this old man. There's a way society is organized and nobody wants to go back there. That's why when we decided to call my center Ujamaa, we were trying to tell society, you know, that, you know, you ask us, because I know you have questions about why we are called Ujamaa, and we start the dialogue from there. Yeah, you know, they'll tell you, but this thing failed. We said, yeah, it doesn't matter if it failed, we are trying it again. So then we do other debates.
Also a period of renewed, and you could say revolutionary optimism with South Africa in the struggle against apartheid.
Yeah,
and also the failure. There's a kind of dialectic there.
And the South African dialectic is, I mean, South Africa had a revolution. They threw out apartheid. But you see, the state in place now is trying to use market mechanisms to bring change. Now, look at the land reforms in South Africa. It has not happened. According to the people who are pushing for land reforms, they put land reforms in terms of statistics. We want to make sure 30%, black population achieve, land reforms by the year this or that. But that land reforms is not exactly something that you can proceed with figures, because some of its achievements are things you cannot touch. Now, what land means to those guys who want to give land is very different. If somebody has been working on a white commercial farm for 40 years and he has been spraying the farm, if you gave him 5 acres today, he wouldn't know what to do with it. In fact, the best thing you do is sell it and you go back to destitution somewhere. So if you don't give this guy land and then accompany it with post-benefit support where you teach him how to farm, clearly you have not done anything. So our problems are not easy problems. They don't require sort of, this quick fix that is so prevalent.
Talking about these movements coming up and where did they go and what happened, is capitalism just stronger than our resolve? And so is our problem capitalism? No matter what we do within, underneath it, small markets, but still going out into the big market, playing capitalism, is it ever really going to be the answer?
Yeah, that question would be so good if you are sitting in a grassroots village and you're talking to just women who go about life every day. They will tell you there's nothing wrong with the market. Africans have always been in the market, and they've played their part in the market, and the market has always been beneficial to communities. I mean, they exchange goods and so on and so forth. Now, there are things in the capital market, that actually make it something else. It ceases to be a market. When you start thinking about things like futures, you're like, okay. I mean, African governments now are telling, people who have money to lend them that, look, we are minerals, so give us the money. I mean, we'll pay you based on these futures. Now, the kind of thing that happened in the US in 2009, when you start doing that kind of thing, it ceases to be market in the sense in which we understand it. And so those distortions are our problem. And our capacity to deal with them is so dismal because of the many things that that divide us. We are in such moments of need that sometimes we just sit back and say, really, what? I mean, and you just let the globe roll. If it's rolling. I mean, and that's why I think these conversations are important. What can we do here, and what can we do there that is significant in those contexts before we talk about what can we do together. Because there's a sense in which there are internal things that we need to do in Africa. Should Africa integrate into the global system the way it is doing? Because I think, for me, that's where the problem is. Yeah. Should we integrate as fast as we're integrating and in the manner in which we are doing? And it's a question that we have to deal with internally. Because it's the elite of Africa who are integrating Africa into the global system uncritically, without asking the right questions. For example, we could, as Africa, say, let's stop for a moment our continued integration into the global system, and first let's try to integrate within our own regional systems. East Africa, for example, has a population of upwards of 50 million. And all those 3 East African countries grow coffee. If we decided in East Africa to drink coffee, I mean, it's a decision we can make. We can say, okay, out of 50 million, if 4 million of us decide to take coffee, let's sell this coffee to each other. I don't think we will need any foreign market for that coffee. And these are the sort of discussions that you don't find, happening in Africa, and yet they are useful discussions that need to happen. If our government said, it's nice to take coffee before a beer, and if we want to give you a license for running a bar, you will have to tell us you have a coffee dispenser. You can do that. I mean, nobody will take you anywhere. I mean, you'll be selling your product. And you tell everybody that coffee before a beer is great. Even the president does it. And, so you move this process from, thinking that coffee must necessarily be sold in the coffee markets, elsewhere. And so I think it's a lack of creative leaders, and people who can think differently about the situation we face. Yes.
We actually grew coffee in Tanzania, but we drank tea. So
yeah, I know. I know.
Being Indian.
Yeah.
What it dawns on me is from the conference for the last 2 days so far, is that the lack of international oversight, or in terms of some sort of an agency or something that can uphold standards. Like you said, there have been agreements, international agreements on mining that are not, there's no enforcement, right? So in terms of the global picture, we need to work together to create the standards and say that we, the people, will create the standards.
Yes, I have a summary of the vision, but then there's also a Kenya oil and gas platform, where we are trying to rethink what do we do with this oil and gas. I can give you these 2 copies, and maybe. Yeah, so there are debates we are not doing, and the question is, what debates should we do? What questions should we ask? Because I think what's happening in Africa is we are answering the wrong questions. I mean, we are doing the wrong debates. It's amazing that all African presidents can troop to China And you know, when they're convened in China, they all go. When an African Union is convened, you hardly get 20 presidents in the room. But when China convenes them, they appear, all of them, including the sick ones, because there are a number of sick ones there. Yeah, so it's
So how do we push them to participate? Because like from what you're saying, everything is hard. They first divide you to get what they want.
right.
And it's really difficult. When we go back in Kenya, when we said no to Jamhuri Park, it was us mothers who stayed in Jamhuri Park for more than a year, stopping these people to build, because they wanted to take the park and build.
Yes.
And we said no. So when we said no as women, it was a no, and we stayed there. They didn't have a way out.
Yeah.
And we managed it as mothers. So today, because of poverty in Africa, in Kenya particularly, the youth will want to get something to eat. Honestly, if you told them, let's do this, they are looking forward to getting something to take back home in the evening. So it becomes a challenge. It's really a big challenge that I don't know, like when I'm listening, I don't know where we can start it. I started something that you know, because I used the 10-year-olds, and it was easy for me then. Today, I cannot compare what I did with the 10-year-olds
with what's happening now.
and what we have today. So when you're talking about Kenya, when you're talking about Kenya for me, I'm looking at you that you should organize the civil society movement, and then yourself, with the help from UN Habitat, because I know if you have something and you pushed it through UN Habitat, somebody will listen to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I think I hope I didn't paint a very grim picture, although the picture is grim. There are lots of little things that are happening. I mean, I think I need to say a few of those so that people understand that it's not all, just dark. I mean, there are lots of spaces that are opening up. And I don't know how many of you, recently we were in the news in the Kenyan parliament. We arrived there with pigs. And we were very enraged by the greed that we see in our national members of parliament. And we thought, let's depict them as pigs. And so we went into a pig farm and, bought pigs and painted names of members of parliament on them. And bought, went to an abattoir and bought some blood, and, we burst the pigs into parliament and put the blood there so that they could feast. Just to make the statement that this greed is a little bit, over the top. Of course, the rage which followed and the debate which followed was one which, the members of parliament are to date extremely, riled by it. And some of the MPs are Muslims, and you know what that means in their context. So there are little things we can do. We tried that with rats. I mean, there was the rat campaign which followed. And there was a donkey campaign where we were saying the donkey is tired. The taxpayer. It's a kind of, the donkey is tired. So there are little creative things here and there. And the youth of today sort of want to do that kind of thing, beyond tweets and, Facebook and so on. It's about us trying to look for those creative spaces, and the little things that we could do that can, kind of push, the agenda, without putting people to risk. I think what today's generation fears is risk. And yet living in a continent like this one is all risk. I mean, it's just that no one is telling them how risky it is. I mean, this is all risk. Look at the way those guys are risking. But when you ask them to just risk a day out without lunch, I mean, they kind of find it difficult. And it's because of the propaganda and the media, the way the media presents struggle. And a lot of people struggle. When you say revolution, people get very, very uneasy. They get very worked up and so on. Sometimes we ask people to just provide their cars. Drive your car to the road and leave it there. We just want to block the road. And we don't want you can leave the car there and go home. It's metal, you know, nobody wants to hurt it. I mean, it's those sorts of little sacrifices that I think the middle class will have to make. And our biggest dilemma is the middle class. It's not even the leaders. It's this class that gets a little salary at the end of the month and, you know, pays some school fees, and, you know, they have 2 kids who are in an international school, and they have this small little car that make them feel, you know, somehow they have arrived. That's the group I think that we need to deal with, maybe even kill it. Yeah, but don't go there. So,
Patrick, on behalf of the organizing committee, I'd like to thank you so much for this workshop.